you're in for a treat. I want everybody to sort of, in your mind's eye, take yourself back almost exactly 50 years. The date is April 4, 1967. At about 9:50 at the Albany County Airport, the Chief Judge of the State of New York, Stanley Fold, greeted the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Earl Warren, who had flown to Albany to deliver the keynote address of the 1967 convention. 2 hours later, at 12:09, in the New York State Assembly chamber, which was crowded to the doors, Earl Warren delivered the keynote address in which he admonished the delegates of that convention to protect fundamental rights and for New York to do its part as a state actor in a federalist society and aggressively defend rights. He was followed to the podium by the governor of the state of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, was followed then by the senior senator of New York State, Jacob Javits, and then was followed by the junior senator, soon-to-be candidate for president, Robert Kennedy. 5 months later, the convention produced its work product, and in November of 1967, because the convention decided to give the voters a single up or down choice, yes or no, as to their work product, voted no. Fast forward 50 years. As Chief Judge DeFiore said, we are but 8 months away from New Yorkers around the state going to their ballot places and looking at a 13-word referendum question. Shall there be a convention to revise the Constitution and amend the same? A 30-something-year-old lawyer in 1968, who had just been a participant in that convention, wrote an article, it's in your materials, talking about what just happened, and he noted that a fascinating aspect of constitutional conventions is the almost willful neglect of the past in organizing them. One reason, he said, is that conventions are separated by at least a generation of the public lives of men, very few of who survive to tell the story the next time a convention comes around. Well, no one in this room this evening will be guilty of that willful neglect. And we are blessed because we have three public men who have seen everything, done everything, know everything about state government, who can tell us what it was like during those 5 months in Albany during the Constitutional Convention. Their biographies we could spend the whole evening talking about, so I'm not going to do that. But I will just note very quickly to my immediate right, for those of you, one of the extraordinarily most accomplished New York lawyers, investment bankers, government officials, Ambassador William Vanden Heuvel. Yes, Ambassador. He spent some time in the United Nations. His career began as a protege of the founder of the CIA's predecessor, Wild Bill Donovan. He was a member of the John F. Kennedy presidential administration. He served under Robert Kennedy when he was Attorney General, and he was, yes, the vice president, or one of them, of the 1967 Constitutional Convention. To my immediate left, Michael Dell Judas is a legend in Albany for all the right reasons. He has seen everything, done everything, and knows everything. He was the chief of staff to Mario Cuomo. He was the director of state operations to Hugh Carey. He was the chief of staff to a New York State speaker, and he was a senior staffer of the preparatory commission that prepared the delegates for the '67 convention. And to Michael's immediate left, Hank Dullea is, there's no one else that knows as much about the '67 convention than him. He literally wrote the book about it. Himself, an extraordinarily accomplished public servant. For many years, director of state operations under Governor Cuomo. He served in the Carey administration as an assistant secretary with the education portfolio. As a young staffer in the Assembly, he got to witness the '67 convention, and after a stint in public service for many years was an esteemed vice president at Cornell University. We are blessed to have these three men in front of you, and I'm going to stop talking, and we should start listening to what they have to say. And I'll have some questions, but let me begin with the ambassador and just say, tell us what your interest was that led you to participating in the convention as a delegate and a vice president.
Thank you very much, Hank. Chief Judge Fiore, honored to have you here tonight and to meet you. And colleagues, Professor, that was a very interesting lecture about our days. Can everybody hear me? No. Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. Those were tumultuous days. John Kennedy had been murdered in 1963. I was the senior New Yorker on Robert Kennedy's staff as Attorney General. And when he determined that he was going to run for the Senate in New York, I came back to New York with him, and we undertook what was certainly one of the great extraordinary adventures in American politics. Succeeding President Kennedy, of course, was a giant of a political legend, Lyndon Johnson, and who accomplished extraordinary things with the New Deal majorities that were given to him by the voters. But among other things, of course, he had an animus for Robert Kennedy that made it very difficult to establish what was happening and what was being done to whom. New York was an extraordinary thing at that time. I mean, you had Heuvel Harriman as governor, you had Nelson Rockefeller, a national, international figure. You had Jake Javits, who was certainly one of the most able senators in the 20th century. And so the question frequently was, is Robert Kennedy going to play a role in New York? Or is this just a platform for the presidency? And so in 1965, 66, that was tested, and among the issues that tested him was the role in the Constitutional Convention. And I had the privilege of being his assistant and his aide and in the position of executing many of the things that were done relating to the convention. There were wonderful people at that convention. When I think of Charles Desmond, who was the Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals, Charles Roselle, who was a judge from Queens, a man of great understanding, wit, and intelligence. There were all kinds of individuals at that convention, and you wondered how we could possibly pull it all together to do what I think most people wanted to do, which was to write a modern constitution for a modern state. Everybody's reflected on the length of the Constitution, the unreadability of it, the hodgepodge character of it in many ways. Well, a lot of us set out to do things that would change that. Our candidate for the presidency of the convention was Charles Desmond, but Nelson Rockefeller's candidate was Tony Travia. And one of the things that I think made it difficult for the convention to be ultimately successful was that the real political power of the state was not represented in the convention. It was represented by those on the outside looking in and deciding what they would not do. Nelson Rockefeller played a commanding role in many instances, certainly by the choice of Travia. And Travia was an excellent president in our experience and a man with much to admire. The basic questions that were before the convention were the questions that deserved constitutional understanding and treatment. Reapportionment. The Blaine Amendment, which is not even talked about anymore, was the commanding issue of that convention. Among those who were there on April 4th, 1967, was Francis Cardinal Spellman. And the Catholic population in the state, which at that time measured, I think, 40% of the people of the state, their hierarchy was determined to repeal the Blaine Amendment, which had somehow or other ended up in our Constitution in 1994 as the work of James G. Blaine, the continental lawyer from the state of Maine, who had run against Grover Cleveland for president. And this Blaine Amendment essentially stated the American doctrine of separation of church and state. But things were changing, and there were many programs and issues there. The hierarchy and the other private schools felt that children should be treated by the state as what their basic needs were, and not on the basis of the separation of church and state. That became an overwhelming issue at this convention. The issue that interested the governor the most was the community development issue. Then there was the question of the judiciary. And it was interesting for those of us who knew we would never sit on a court probably, to watch judges behave. It was a very real fracas. And a lot of words were spoken in the course of that convention to each other and to the convention that left people's hair standing, frankly. And then the fact that so many people were there to protect and defend their personal interest, or as they saw it. So what you need in a constitution, which is a document that hopefully resolves the political, economic, and social dilemmas and separations among people, which requires nonpartisan minds in such a respect, not much of that was there when you got to discussing issues like the judiciary. Referenda are very difficult things to manage. We've seen that in our own day. We've seen Brexit, what happens when you let loose in a representative democracy the opportunity to vote on a single issue where there are forces that are collected to make it happen. And so a referendum is probably not the best means by which you could adopt and to reform a constitution. And I think there were so many things, for example, in the judiciary article, which is of most interest here, the person that we counted on to hold it together and to make was Jack Weinstein, who many of you know as the former chief judge of the Eastern District. Well, Jack was someone greatly esteemed by those of us who worked with him. But unfortunately or fortunately for him, at the very moment that we were to start the convention, and he was the executive director of the Judiciary Committee, he got the federal appointment through Robert Kennedy to the Eastern District and left us. Would have made a big difference. We had just gone through the election, well, the election of '66 itself, where all of us were elected, et cetera, was something to remember. You had Frank O'Connor running, and you had the Liberal Party nominating Franklin D. Roosevelt, Jr. So the Democratic Party was extraordinarily divided in that context. You had a convention where Howard Samuels at first established himself as an upstate businessman who had ambitions to be governor, properly so. And he was one of those who really pushed for the convention to be organized. And he pushed it on the basis of one man, one vote, which the Supreme Court had only decided in '64, arguing that we should have a unicameral legislature in the light of that vote, rather than the bicameral legislature that we had. Jack Weinstein was Robert Kennedy's candidate to be Attorney General in that election. And when we turned our heads for a brief moment, we got Mayor Sedita of Buffalo. You know, I never forgot his opening words as he accepted the nomination is, "I am the best mayor that money can buy." So we had a candidate also for lieutenant governor that we thought was awfully good, Orrin Lehman. And instead of Orrin winning the nomination, when Bobby decided to go back to New York, Ray Jones and others turned that convention around and nominated Howard Samuels. So there was a lot of feeling in the air. I think Frank Hogan had emerged from that convention himself as a candidate for the Senate, the United States Senate. And so the liberals and the conservatives were bitterly divided. In any event, Bobby decided that he was going to play as significant a role as he could in the convention, and I had the privilege of being identified as a Kennedy spokesman on many issues, and treated as he would have been treated, hooted, booted, yelled at, all the other things that you can go through in a constitutional. But I'll tell you, there was an experience, and we'll get to whether you recommend or not recommend that we have another Constitution Convention. But it was an experience where the issues that made up our state were debated and effectively challenged and discussed more than in any other forum that I can imagine in recent years. Many of the people who were at the convention, the younger people, use it as a major mark forward in their own careers and end up in very significant posts in the federal and states and local governments in the state. But what definitely came out of that convention was a generation that understood what the problems of our state were, and that gave significant understanding to what should be done about them. And over a course of years, I think ultimately we would say it worked. Thank you.
Hi, Mike Dell, Judas. I'm glad we're not standing up. Makes it a lot easier to talk. I was, as you said, Hank, on the way over here in the cab, I was saying, how many people are going to be there tonight to talk about the Constitutional Convention? So, like Hank, it's kind of pleasing. Either you have no social life, or you're here to learn something interesting. I got involved in New York State politics when, in 1964, with a fellow named Gene Nickerson, who was a county executive in Nassau County, the only Democratic, I think, elected official in the state during that time. The entire rest of the state, I guess it was Travia and Zaretsky were still in at that time. It was a 4-year period of time when, after 1964, that the Democrats had control of the Senate and the Assembly. That's the period that we're talking about. After that, it went back to Republican for a long period of time until you carry. But I got involved very early in the Temporary State Commission to revise the Constitution. I had been working in Nassau County, as I said, and one of my bosses was introduced to the executive director of the commission, a fellow named Sol Corbin. Some of you may know him or know of him, but he was a counsel to Nelson Rockefeller, very brilliant, very hard-nosed, very tough guy. When I used to write some papers and occasionally it had to go through Sol, he would just rip them up and shred them. So he gave everybody a good learning experience in the process. The Temporary Commission, I think, is an important part, if there is going to be a convention, that a temporary commission be established. And the governor proposed an amount of money last year, I think $1 million. The legislature took it out, so it's still not available, but presumably it will be added to the budget if this fall happens. The commission was staffed by just a couple of things. It was staffed by professionals who knew, mostly legal, knew about the issues, but it was driven in part, like everything else related to this whole process, by the politics. And even the commission members, who were very smart members from all around the state, took their sides and their positions, and it was a very hard-nosed battle. Even getting to the point of establishing the commission was fraught with a lot of political problems. I think it was created early in the year. It didn't get around to being finally appointed when Sol became chairman in December, and it had to produce a report in March. So it was literally 100 days. And when I got there, we worked around the clock that period of time to produce some reports, most of which I thought were pretty good. Some of them were not. But the importance of having a temporary commission beforehand is to lay out the issues. And to put, what we decided to do was a big decision, how to write the report. Should it take a position? Should it give the pros and cons? And so ultimately it wound up being, I guess, 30 or so books, which I still have 300 copies of in case anybody wants a copy. I do actually have 300 copies. We had them left over. Nobody wanted them, so they were all done. But they were very well written books by the time they were done and laid out pros and cons. And I think they were useful for the initial delegates that got elected. But I think one of the main issues that needs to be confronted is who the delegates are and how they get selected. I think the governor in this current position has said he would like legislators not to be delegates. It's hard to prevent people not to run, so that's going to be an interesting battle as to how this plays out. That is the selection of the delegate process. But laying out the issues and analyze them in a deep way is the only way you can really understand the process. Once it gets into the convention, of course, then politics takes hold. And that whole process, as Bill described, played out, and Hank will describe, in a very tough way. The bad part of the convention, I think, in '67 was that the legislature controlled so much of it. And as Bill said, it was hinged on one issue. I ran for Congress in 1968 at age 25. And even before that, the Blaine issue, aid to parochial schools, was like the dominant issue of the time. You had to decide whether you were for it or whether you were against it. That defined your democratic politics. Today, we don't have so much of an overriding single issue, I think. A lot of the social issues that were troublesome during that time have passed, and now it's more, what kind of government do you want, how to refine it, how to make it operate better. It's much more of a mechanical, I think, kind of judgment. So if there is to be a vote on the convention, I'm not quite sure how it'll turn out this fall. We'll see. It's an off year, meaning statewide. There are no statewide officials running. It's an on year for the New York City mayoralty. In cases where there are referenda, usually that's the kind of year you want to have, if you're for it, you want to have an amendment on the ballot, because New York City will turn out. New York City votes everything yes, and so upstate votes everything no, but it turns out in non-statewide elections, 60% of the vote usually comes out of New York City, so the referenda usually win. When we decide what years to put referenda on the ballots, it's in the New York City election year. If it's not in the New York City election year, you lose. It took a long while for people to figure that out, but that's the way it works. So we'll see how it turns out. I think it'll be an interesting process. If it goes forward, I would encourage you to perhaps consider running for delegate. It's a fascinating process. I learned more at age, whatever I was, 22, 23, in 100 days than I could have learned in 10 years. Just getting deep into the process and working with people who were heavily involved in it. So it's an interesting time. In many ways, it's an academic discussion. But, you know, when you talk about not life and death in this case, but, you know, aid to parochial schools or the structure of the courts, and why there were so many pages on the court in the Constitution is because lawyers write it. And they have to keep talking, so that's what happens. But anyhow, I would encourage you to certainly follow the process, but if possible, to think about running as a delegate. It would be interesting. Hank?
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Hank Dullea, and it's my great pleasure to be on this panel, both with my good friend and fellow colleague during the Mario Cuomo years, Mike Dell Judas, and my colleague on the hustings talking about constitutional conventions, Peter Galey, and one of the real heroes of the 1967 convention, Bill vanden Heuvel. Hank Greenberg asked us all to sort of begin by saying, how do we get into this discussion to begin with? And I came to Albany in January 1965 as a result of the Lyndon Johnson landslide. It produced the unthinkable, namely a Democratic majority in both houses of the legislature. Hadn't happened since the Great Depression.
And hasn't happened, well, happened
once. Well, right.
Since then.
I went to work as a budget analyst for both the Ways and Means Committee in the Assembly and the Senate Finance Committee. We had very, very small staff at the time. And I confess, I had never, ever thought about the New York State Constitution until that time. Well, that changed pretty quickly for me. The first year of a Democratic majority in the legislature was absolute chaos. Factional strife here in the city prevented the election of Democratic legislative leaders for more than a month, with the Republicans finally weighing in after they started being criticized for it as well, to give their support to Anthony Travia and Joe Zaretsky, who had been the previous minority leaders in the legislature. They started to move the legislative session forward, but the very structure of the legislature was under attack, you might say, as a result of the reapportionment decisions taking place at the national level. The United States Supreme Court had handed down Baker versus Carr, and then Reynolds versus Sims applied to the states. And right here in New York, it was a radio station, WMCA versus John Lomenzo, the Secretary of State, that made the decision applying it to the New York State legislature. And one person, one vote became the standard. Life with the courts at that time was interesting because the Republicans, having just lost the election in November of 1964, said, okay, we're going to pass 4 alternative reapportionment plans. Maybe one of them will stick. Each one perhaps more conservative than the other from their perspective. And by conservative, I mean giving them a better chance of a majority. And the courts had a grand time. The federal courts ultimately threw out 3 of the 4. The Court of Appeals then threw out the 4th one. And the federal courts then told the Court of Appeals, get out of the way, we're taking charge of this. It was chaos. People who had been elected for a 2-year term in November of 1964 were told that they were no longer going to serve for 2 years. They were going to have to run for re-election immediately in November of 1965. It was in this environment that the Democrats, who had since the days of 1915, when Al Smith, God rest his soul, said that New York was constitutionally Republican, the Democrats had been pleading for constitutional relief on the reapportionment article of the Constitution to give all these immigrants in the urban areas an opportunity to weigh in and have a chance at getting a majority. So the legislature passed special legislation putting the question on the ballot, out of order, out of the 20-year sequence. And in November of 1965, Governor Rockefeller signed the legislation. Speaking of temporary commissions, Mike, he had been the chair of Averell Harriman's commission appointed before 1957. In fact, Harriman wasn't very happy with the fact that Nelson went around the state talking about the Constitution and decided, hey, this is kind of fun, I might even run for governor. Oh, well. So unlike their decision in 1957, the voters this time said, yes, let's have a convention. And for me personally, it was, oh boy, I've got a chance actually now to write a doctoral dissertation and spend every day at the convention producing, for your information, charter revision in the Empire State, available through Amazon.com. Now, it's already been mentioned that reapportionment was very significant, but you know, the courts had really made all the decisions by the time the convention came into operation. New district lines had been imposed, and the delegate selection, other than for the 15 at-large who were going to be elected statewide, and Bill was one of those at-large delegates, selecting the 3 delegates from each senatorial district, which is what the Constitution requires, that's way down at the bottom of the ballot. Not many people were paying attention to it. They were paying attention to the gubernatorial race between, on the Republican ticket, Nelson Rockefeller and Malcolm Wilson, against Frank O'Connor of Queens, the district attorney, and as you've heard, Howard Samuels for lieutenant governor. Mike has just indicated the Blaine Amendment issue was really the only issue that delegates were called being pressed on during the election period. There was not an upswing of other issues that were confronting everyone other than the reapportionment issue, but that's, you know, they're in the courts. So most of the delegates who were elected, other than perhaps what I would refer to as a lot of the reformers on the at-large slate, came to Albany in 1967 with a relatively blank slate. Some people just said it was an empty brain. No, it was a blank slate. Little reason for change. You've heard that the opening day was quite a show. The Chief Justice of the United States, Senator Javits, Senator Kennedy, Governor Rockefeller, all there, the Cardinal giving the blessing. Travia had been selected in part with the support of Governor Rockefeller, but also in part because he promised that he could organize the convention and get it running quickly. He pointed to the 38 convention, which had been led by the Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals, Frederick Crane. That was seen as a less partisan endeavor, which took forever to organize. They ended up with some 35 committees or so, took forever. Travia promised, we ain't gonna have that happen again. Travia promised, quote, a new and simple constitution that will permit our states and localities to solve their problems in a working partnership with the federal government. That theme of freeing the state from restrictions in the Constitution so that it could effectively participate with the emerging programs of the Great Society was a theme that ultimately had a lot of attention during the convention. Now, who were the delegates? There were 186 delegates. They included a member of the United Nations staff, a sitting member of Congress, 13 sitting state legislators. Hold on, 28 sitting or retired judges, including 2 sitting members of the Court of Appeals and the presiding judges of the first and second departments. Former and future mayors of the city of New York, Robert Wagner, Abe Beame, David Dinkins, all delegates. 10 women out of the 186, 13 Black and Hispanic members, a cross-section of local officials, mayors, local attorneys. Speaking of attorneys, lots of attorneys. The largest occupational group in the convention, 67% of them, attorneys. The lack of a clear consensus reform agenda ultimately spelled doom for structural reform in the Constitution, whether in the executive, judicial, or legislative branches, or in the sections dealing with local government and finance. The election of the legislative leaders of both parties, Travia for the Democrats and Earl Bridges, the leader of the Senate for the Republicans, made clear that there would be no fundamental changes in the legislature's operations other than increasing its own responsibilities. It should be perhaps of particular interest to this audience that proposed structural changes in the judiciary article proved to be among the most contentious issues of the convention. The suggested merger of most of the state's trial courts into Supreme Court, the appointment rather than the election of many judges, including judges of the Court of Appeals, the substitution of primaries for nominating conventions, the administration of the entire system by the Court of Appeals, and the responsibility for the appointment of local non-judicial personnel were issues that divided the delegates. For the most part, suggestions for judicial system change were handily defeated. But the Constitutional Convention provided an opportunity for those important questions to be publicly debated in a way that was simply not possible in the normal legislative sessions. Now, given the sponsorship of this evening's event, I should note that the behavior of a number of the judges serving as delegates was occasionally a cause for scandal. Ambassador vanden Heuvel has already mentioned it. The administrative judge of the Supreme Court here in Manhattan, Saul Street, was particularly at fault. Early in the debates, he had made fun of the, quote, little lady who chaired the Judiciary Committee of the New York State League of Women Voters, Betty Schack, suggesting that she had no business making recommendations to the convention since she was not herself a judge. Now, that personal criticism was certainly a factor in the League's ultimate opposition to the entire Constitution. In the closing days of the convention, Street made fun of another delegate's name, producing boos from the rest of the delegates and guaranteeing from that point forward that anything Street opposed would receive overwhelming support. And indeed it did. Seeing some of these judges in action was an eye-opener for both the other delegates and for the media. Imagine, they said, what it must be for some of the attorneys who have to practice before these individuals. When it became clear that structural reforms were going nowhere, the Democratic leaders turned to a number of important policy objectives in hope of securing popular support for the final product. Late in the convention's deliberations, they obtained majorities for the phased-in state takeover of the cost of local welfare programs, including Medicaid. Now, that didn't just come up in the Republican plan for the Affordable Care Act repeal of a few weeks ago. 50 years ago, the convention was proposing to take over that local share of not just Medicaid, but all local welfare. The phased-in state takeover of the local costs of the unified court system, revised standards for aid to public schools, and a new community development program that envisioned public-private partnerships to alleviate poverty, expand public housing, and strengthen social services. These initiatives were popular with the Democratic delegates, but they generated intense opposition from both their Republican counterparts and fiscal conservatives in the general public. When the final decision was made on the last day of the 1967 convention to submit its work as a single package, an all or nothing, take it or leave it proposition, the public's rejection was overwhelming. The conflicts among religious groups over the repeal of the Blaine Amendment and its substitution by the language of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution had soured much of the public's perception of the convention. Excuse me. And the fiscal debates over the majority's programmatic initiatives gave the impression of a unicameral legislature gone wild without the discipline of a gubernatorial veto. I've written that the 1967 convention was, quote, a magnificent failure. It failed to secure a majority vote in favor of its final product, but many of its initiatives were subsequently adopted, while others remain outstanding with us today. So again, it's a great pleasure for me to be on this panel with my colleagues, and I thank you very much for your attention.
So I have one quick question for each panelist, and then we'll hear from the next panel. But Ambassador, help us to get a feeling for what it was like to be on the floor of the convention as a leader of the convention. How was it in the sense of, did it feel like a partisan political fight or a high-minded discussion of fundamental freedoms? What was it like for you?
I think, as someone suggested, had we seated the delegates...
If you could speak up.
Had we seated the delegates... Can you hear? No. Had we seated the delegates alphabetically instead of by party, there's a possibility that you would have had a different chemistry in that situation. And I'm sorry we didn't try it at least, but we were divided from the beginning. And one side and the other. And Earl Breeches was a brilliant manager of the Republican Party, and Tony Travia was an equally brilliant leader for the Democrats. So that from the very beginning, the partisan nature of it was there. But on the other hand, partisanship has divided every political institution in this country, and it's still, we've had a lot of things that were possible to be done. The finer moments of finer moments in the convention were things like the suggestion that higher education in New York be free. I mean, this is 50 years ago, and we were talking about that. We were talking, Peter Crotty from Buffalo was the chairman of the Labor Committee, and he had in the language of the Labor Committee that labor is not a commodity. And there was if we had been able to adopt this, I think we would have succeeded in many ways in changing the nature of that Constitution itself. I've always felt that to prepare for a Constitution Convention is absolutely essential. And I was a great admirer of John MacDonald, who was a professor at Cornell University, who was essentially the founder of the Law Revision Commission. And I think what should have been established was a permanent commission for the consideration of amendments and changes to the Constitution. And I think we would have had, if we'd had an interim body like that, that made reports and followed and worked with the convention, I think we would have had a more successful time. But as Hank has said, this was a magnificent failure, and much of it was subsequently enacted by the legislature. And I think if we take some time and study what we didn't do correctly in 1967, that it's possible to get a very successful convention out of the next one.
Michael, the 67 convention, there were, I think, 186 delegates. If there was a convention called for 2019, there'd be 204 delegates. In 1967, where did the staff come from for the convention? How important were they, not just in the preparatory work, but the operation of that 5-month convention?
Well, as it turns out, given the fact that the governor wanted Speaker Traurig to be the chairman of the convention, it was pretty easy. It was Hank and about 20 of his colleagues who worked on the Assembly Ways and Means Committee that really were the staff of it. So it was really very much an institutionalized legislative effort, and it was totally controlled by both by Traurig and by Rockefeller.
But I think it's fair to say, isn't it, Mike,
I'm sorry?
that Traurig insisted that the staff be nonpartisan.
Yeah.
And the quality of the staff in the convention is something to really be registered. And that was because of Tony Traurig, perhaps Nelson Rockefeller too.
Yeah.
Certain Robert Kennedy insisted upon. You had people in the convention like Alan Campbell, who went on to become head of the civil service in the country. And he had as his staff assistant Donna Shalala, who we all know from a different career. But there were really outstanding members of the staff.
Yeah, it was a great spawning ground for a lot of folks, both on the staff level and the delegate level, who then stayed in politics, which was obviously very good. And I think, as Hank pointed out and Bill mentioned, I would say 70% of the proposals that were in that convention, in that document, ultimately became law. And maybe, you know, in retrospect, the fact that they became law in their time was better than having it done all at once. The mistake is getting a highly controversial issue like the Blaine Amendment to be the spark plug of the whole debate, and that covered everything. And it was simply up or down.
Totally illogical to have a single vote on the Constitution. The logic was, if the Catholic community was so interested in the Blaine Amendment, we gave that to them. Early in the convention, the repeal of the Blaine Amendment was agreed to. Well, if this was going to bring out a tremendous number of maybe conservative voters, then the liberal part of the Constitution would bring out others. So we thought that there would be a merger of the liberals and conservatives' interests that would compel each to vote for the Constitution.
Hank, let me just mention with Donna Shalala. We got 2 dissertations out of this 1968. Donna Shalala did her dissertation on the 1968 convention. She called it The City and the Constitution. She focused on city urban issues, but she also went on to be a successful Ph.D. on the 67 convention.
So finally, Hank, many people, the last time there was a debate over whether to have a convention 20 years ago in 1997, and then 20 years prior in 1977, critics of a potential convention, both referendums pointed to the 67 convention as Exhibit A, why New York should not do that again. You come to a different conclusion. What is it about the 67 convention that gives you hope that things might turn out differently this time around if the voters say yes?
Well, I think in 1977, it was a short period of time, 10 years, since the 67 demise. And people remembered the acrimony that had been created, especially by the Blaine debate, and were uncertain about going into that again. By 1997, I think we had a different dynamic. People, if you looked at polling, and they did polling from the Siena Research Institute, going right up to the question in November of 1997, and people were saying yes, they were inclined to vote in support of having a convention. But then we had about 10 days of intense advertising by the public employee unions in opposition. They had decided, to me, beyond the facts, that a convention was a threat to the provision of the Constitution which guarantees that their public pensions shall be neither reduced or impaired. And all over the state, these television ads came up and so forth. That same pattern is happening right now. The teachers' union and so forth. And if you are to look across the country, it is happening in other states. The basic argument, I think, today, given the strength of the unions in the public sector, is that they own the process as it is. I've heard many a leader say the process sucks, but we run it. We know how to operate it. They pay, they're the largest lobbying expense group in the state last year, in 2015. NYSA and UUP were the single largest lobbying spenders. They do it across parties. They make sure that the majorities in both houses are supported by them, and they in turn say, well, we're not going to upset your apple cart. I think it's time to upset the apple cart. I think it's time when we have one leader after another of our legislature being indicted, convicted, going to jail. It's not just limited to the legislature. I don't mean to criticize them only. We've got a former state comptroller in prison right now as well. We have people close to the governor under indictment. One of the advantages of a constitutional convention is that it brings together this mix of people, not simply office holders, but also in the last convention, social workers, teachers, automobile dealers, et cetera, along with, as I said, a lot of lawyers, who are not wedded to all of the details of the existing structure and can look at whether we have term limits for members, term limits for leaders, whether we have changes on this infamous message of necessity process that causes budgets to be passed when nobody knows what's in them because we excuse the 3-day requirement the bills be on the desk of members so that at least the member has a chance to read the bill, let alone the public. I mean, there are a host of things that need fundamental attention by people with common sense, and I think you can get that in a constitutional convention if you are prepared to run for it, as Michael has urged all of you in this audience to consider doing, but also if there is a consensus reform agenda that people can rally around, so going into a convention, people know what they're going to try to achieve.
I think it should also be said, though, that the issue that really defeated the Constitution was finances. Once the convention adjourned, the campaign against it that was very well organized and very well financed argued that to adopt this Constitution would bankrupt the state. And that was the issue, I think, that most people voted on. And if we are to organize another constitutional convention, there had better be a group that's working at the same time, how do you present it to the people of the state so that they understand the positive aspects of it. I think it's true also that this Bar Association supported it, didn't it, Hank?
97?
Yeah.
No,
I mean, the Bar Association is 67.
Opposed the convention in 97.
No, but it passed, supported the Constitution. This Bar Association.
Oh, the 67 Constitution.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
This Bar Association was one of the major groups in the state that supported it.
Well, I think all of us in this room feel a debt of gratitude to these three great New Yorkers and public servants for taking the time to share their thoughts with us.